Welcome to the tutorial on learning React. In this video, I'm going to talk about understanding render. Now, I mentioned in the previous video that the render function is incredibly important, and it's the core fundamental aspect of what we use when we're working with React within a web application development setting. Now, coming back to that, I'd like to highlight something different this time. Again, we're using that render function down here, React DOM.render. Very important, this kicks everything off. This time though, things are a little bit different. In the previous video, it was this code right here on line 8. And I mentioned we could start to use HTML within this document. And I didn't talk through what that meant yet, but I said we could start to do that. And that was what made React special and how it helped us develop and stuff. Now, down here on line 14, we see HTML, sort of. It looks like an HTML element, but it's also a little bit different. And I want to highlight two things about this. The first of which is that notice it started with a capital letter, and it also is opening and self-closing. So it's got its self-closing right here. Now, this is another thing that makes React different. I mentioned in the previous video, one of the things that makes React different is that we can start to mix in HTML. The second of which is that classes within React are actually HTML elements when we use them as components. That may seem a little bit confusing, but let's jump up and come back. So we understand there's this new element going on right here in render, and its name is example. Well, if we look up to the top of this code, and right here on line 5, we see there's now a class named example. It also extends React component. React component is one of the different classes we can use within React. We can think of components as sections of the interface. So we're making a component, it's going to show something or do something. So we're using React.component, this class, and now our example extends that. So its parent is React component. Now what's important to remember about components is all components render. That is, they are a section of the interface, so they should render something. And so in this case, similar to down here with this render function, it has its own render function. And notice it's not doing a whole lot. All it's really doing is has a return statement right here on line 7 that extends to line 9. Within that is the same HTML we saw last time. So I'm going to pause and let's go look at what the development server is showing us. Popping over to Chrome, we see we're still running on localhost on port 3000. And it's still showing us hello world, which looked exactly the same in the previous video when we're just using header 1 and rendering that. So it looks the same, but the underlying code is a lot different. So let's come back to that. So I mentioned that classes that extend React component are actually HTML elements. And so that's what we've asked React to do right here on line 14. We said, hey, render this element. And elements are classes if they extend from React component. So I said render example. It said okay, and it went to go look to see if a class existed named example that extended React component. And it does right here on lines 5 through 11. That's the class right here. So once it got to that, it said, hey, I want you to render, and then it called its own render function. So we can think of these as starting to think in React as nested rendering functions. Render down here in React DOM looks for anything else that's an object. Within those objects, it looks for its own render. And we can start to nest all of these things together and start to, as we'll see in the coming videos, build more complex projects by using this very simple idea of understanding the importance of this render function. So it all starts down here with React DOM that starts its render cycle. Then it checks to see if it has any HTML to render. If it does, it renders it. If it runs into those it doesn't know, for example, right here, it then checks to see if a class exists for that. If it does, and it extends React component, it means it's now a component in React. Then it checks to see if it has a render function. If it does, it calls it. In this case, we're just returning hello world. So it's doing the same things, but now it's doing it through multiple steps. But it gets us two important concepts as I close this video. The first of which is, yes, we can continue to mix in HTML, known HTML elements we can also invent new ones. When we invent new ones, we have to make sure they match existing classes we're using that are React components. And that allows us to basically build the result of using that HTML. So we can start to include our own HTML elements that are actually based on classes we're using that are components. So our interface is HTML, but behind the scenes, all that HTML is connected to existing JavaScript classes that extend React component and that are rendering their own things. So we have all of these components within our interface, all of which render independently of everything else. And this really helps us when we're building interfaces. Some things can react in their own way, dynamically react, and render their own content and refresh themselves in dynamic ways. All of that, of course, is down the line a bit, but the most important concept, especially in this video, is understanding that importance of that render function. It starts with React DOM, and then it moves into any classes that extend React component. Components must render. If we have components, they render, and we can use those as sections of our interfaces as we build more complicated projects in React. Thanks for watching.